I like to always take a bit of time to tell you about what we do, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it, because I think it's important. It's important for you to understand these different aspects of the process, and it might not always be evident. You might think, well, why am I asked to do this? Why am I asked to fill out these questionnaires? Why is it relevant to how to look after my loved one who has a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia? So I hope it'll become clearer. Just as a show of hand, who was here? Who's been here before? So not that many, a few people. Okay, which is good. So there are new faces. So what I'll do is I'll give you just a little bit of background about the history of frontotemporal dementia, because it's a long history, but it's also a very short one. And you'll see why it is that not many people know about frontotemporal dementia. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the history of Frontal, and also highlight a couple of research projects that we've been working on, particularly in the past year or so. And also, I've just come back from the International Frontotemporal Dementia Conference, which was held last week in Amsterdam. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. There was good presentations by our group, and I was very proud of all these presentations. All right, so Frontal, who are we? We started in late 2007. So it started with John Hodges, who's a behavioral neurologist from Cambridge. And John came over for a sabbatical in Sydney in 2002 to work with Glenda Halliday, who's a neuropathologist who was interested in neurodegeneration in general. So John stayed in 2002, went back to Cambridge, where he was leading a group, a research group, and doing behavioral neurology in Cambridge. He was convinced to come over to Sydney and got a Federation Fellowship. So he arrived in 2007, and I was there working with Glenda, having just come back from my postdoctoral fellowship in the US. And so we started Frontal together in late 2007-8, which was at that time at Neuroscience Research Australia, which is just next to UNSW, so on the other side of the city. And we were there for about 8 years, and then we were courted by the University of Sydney to travel across and come here. And so we moved in 2017 here at the Brain and Mind Center, and we've been here ever since. So the photo that you see here is actually our first Christmas lunch of the team in 2007. So you can see that there's 5 of us plus me, 6 people. And that was the grand team. And then that was us celebrating our 15th anniversary 2 years ago. So we've grown over the years. And we were very fortunate, actually, because there were people coming back who came back from South America, from the UK, and there was, South America and UK. And USA as well, who came back for that. So I was very pleased to see the whole team. And so that's us. So frontotemporal dementia, some people might have heard of Pick's disease. So Arnold Pick, that's a photo of Arnold Pick here on the left-hand side. Arnold Pick was a neurologist. He was a Czech neurologist who realized that he was seeing people who were presenting with focal language problems. And the problem with language were progressing and were getting worse. And over the years, he also realized that when looking at the brains of these people after their death, they had changes in the brain that were very focal. So only a small portion of the brain was affected. And so in 1892, he published his first paper on cases of focal brain atrophy. And that was way before the first cases of Alzheimer's disease were reported. So when I say a long history, it's the history of frontotemporal dementia is actually longer than that of Alzheimer's disease. So in 1911, Alois Alzheimer, who's on the right-hand side, they actually described the changes in the brain. And Alzheimer noticed that the changes in the brain that in the cases that Arnold Pick had reported about were different to what you can find under the microscope when you look at the brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease. So that was the first discovery, or the first hint that the frontotemporal dementia was very much a different disorder, brain disease, than Alzheimer's disease. So we were looking at two different things here. But after that, there's the long lost years of frontotemporal dementia research. So it's only in 1950s that there were two major papers that were published in the 1950s about looking at the clinical presentations and relationship to the changes that you can see in the brain in frontotemporal dementia. And again, there's a big gap. And until the 70s, so we're talking about 50 years ago, that clinically people mostly were thinking that you couldn't identify people with changes in the brain that were of Alzheimer's disease and those that were from frontotemporal dementia. So clinically undistinguishable. And it's only in 1990s, so this paper is 1994, so 30 years ago, that there's this paper that goes, actually, if you use neuropsychological tests, so tests of attention, memory, language, that you can discriminate between these two types of dementia. So there we're looking at very short history in terms of clinical diagnosis of this disorder. And then there's a few papers coming out in the 1990s. So this is the first publication on consensus diagnostic criteria. So bringing in the same room a number of clinicians and discussing how best to diagnose, identify people with frontotemporal dementia, and trying to understand which are the clinical features, characteristics are really specific to frontotemporal dementia as opposed to Alzheimer's disease or the other forms of brain disorders. So there's this paper in the mid-90s, and this one in 2001, so again, 23 years ago, looking at more the pathology side of things. And then these two papers published 13 years ago, so both published in 2011, one focusing on the left-hand side on the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, and the other one looking at the language presentations of frontotemporal dementia. So there was these classifications where people agreed that in frontotemporal dementia, there were three main presentations clinically. So there's one that is behavioral, so it's called behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. And then there are two language presentations. One is called semantic dementia, and the other one is called progressive non-fluent aphasia, depending on the type of difficulties that the person is having with their language skills. Now, you might have heard also different labels, which comes under primary progressive aphasias. So there's the semantic variants of primary progressive aphasia and non-fluent variant of primary progressive aphasia. So these two, semantic dementia and progressive non-fluent aphasia, denote the same thing as these two there. It's just that it's different classifications, different type of, because it's focusing very much on language rather than the overall clinical presentation. I'll just flag that under the primary progressive aphasia classification, there's also this logopenic variant that comes under this umbrella. But logopenic is slightly different in what is happening in the brain. So it's not technically speaking part of the broad umbrella of frontotemporal dementia. So why are we interested in frontotemporal dementia? So we have these classifications, these groups of or subgroups of clinical features. So the behavioral variant, the semantic variant, there are some cases that are mixed, the non-font variant, and then there are some people who will present also with additional motor features, so problem with walking, with balance, and with motor coordinations. So just with that, you can appreciate that it's quite a complex presentation. As opposed to Alzheimer's disease, when people, when they hear Alzheimer's disease, they think predominant memory problems. So can't remember where I put my keys, I can't find my way around, I can't recognize people, which is what people tend to think about when they think about dementia. So frontotemporal dementia is more varied, and in actual fact, in the clinical reality is that you tend not to see, you know, an orange, someone fully in the orange block, but you know, they will have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So it's really difficult when you see someone for the first time to get a diagnosis, because it can be quite difficult. It can be confused with other disorders, most commonly with psychiatric disorders. So there's this difficulty at the clinical level. And again, that's just another cartoon to show the overlap between the different presentations. Now, what's happening in the brain also is more varied. So it's just, I don't expect you to understand these differences, but what it's showing here, it's microscopic slice of brain tissue, and just showing the different types of changes that you can see in the brain in these small squares. So you can see here that there's a, you know, here it's called FTLD TDP type B. So you have deposition within a nerve, a neuron, a nerve cells, but this type is different to that one, and so on. So you have a multiplicity of brain changes. And then when you put these two things together, you can see that it's a bit of a mess. So trying to link the clinical presentations at the top with what is happening in the brain at the bottom. And the different colors are just to show which pathologies in the brain you can find for each of these clinical presentations. So if you take, for example, someone with the behavioral frontotemporal dementia, they could have any of these pathologies, some blue pathologies, some green ones, and even some yellow ones. So it's quite messy. And so all the research that we've been doing is to try to understand what is happening at that level. So how do people present? How can we diagnose people early? How can we detect early changes? And also try to link the clinical aspects to what is happening in the brain. So can we find a link that will tell us, well, if you have certain features, if you have more language problems or more behavior problems, you're more likely to have one of these changes in the brain. And also try to develop tests directly that will measure some of these changes in the brain. So as a summary slide, so the main questions for us is that, so how do we connect these parts, so when we see people in the clinic, to the changes in the brain? And again, it's to show the connections. So a little bit of work to be done here. And so a simple summary is one pathology will lead to multiple symptoms, and one symptoms can have multiple pathologies. And that's another one to show the same thing. It's the clinical diagnosis and how it's related to what is happening in the brain. Yeah, so there's a bit of detective work that's been happening in that space. Yes. Motor neuron disease. Yes. Sorry. So there's, we now know that pathologically, so what is happening in the brain in some people with frontotemporal dementia, they have the same pathological changes as people with motor neuron disease. So there's an overlap between these two disorders. So some people first diagnosed with motor neuron disease will also develop features of frontotemporal dementia, and vice versa. Depending on the clinical presentations, there's a greater or lower risk of developing signs of motor neuron disease. So if you have language presentations, the risk is much lower. If you have a presentation that is more behavioral, there's a greater risk there. Yes, if you have questions, just wave. Penny. Correct. So logopenic, I'll just come back to there. So logopenic variant of primary progressive aphasia is also what is considered a non-fluent presentation of primary progressive aphasia. So people have difficulty expressing themselves. The speech is disrupted. So understanding what other people are saying is fine. It's more the expressive aspect of language that is impaired. In the brain, it's what you find, there are changes that are similar to the changes you see in what is called typical Alzheimer's disease. So again, people who tend to have more memory problems. So the same pathological changes, but in a different part of the brain. So in terms of, so why is it important to make the distinction between logopenic variant of primary progressive aphasia and the other non-fluent presentation? It's in terms of treatments and potential drug availability. So with logopenic variant means that these individuals would potentially benefit from the drugs that are developed for Alzheimer's disease more broadly. Whereas if you have a non-fluent non-fluent variant of primary progressive aphasia, these drugs won't do any good to you because what is happening in the brain is completely different. As I said, the pathology is of different kind. Yes, so as you can appreciate now, so FTD, frontotemporal dementia, complex disorder with multiple presentations, multiple pathologies. And the issues arising from there are listed a little bit here, is that it leads to a delayed diagnosis and prognosis. So difficulty understanding what is happening, putting the right label on the person, and then to be able to help the person and the family along the journey. The confusion with psychiatric disorders that I've mentioned before, mostly with major depressive disorders or bipolar because of the changes in behavior that you see in some individuals. And also there are some unique clinical challenges because it's a younger onset dementia in most people. Often it's found in people who are otherwise physically active and fine. So you have also people with young families, so still in the workforce and potentially with young children. So the financial burden is also very different to someone who would develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease in their 70s or 80s when they're no longer in the workforce. This complexity also then is a barrier to drug development, because obviously if you don't understand fully what is the mechanisms of change in the brain, then it becomes very difficult to develop the right drug that will target these changes. And yes, over the years, few existing formal support and certainly in terms of this presentation, what we know, and we've done research on that, is that it has a high burden on carers. Looking after someone with frontotemporal dementia is complex and difficult and has a toll on quality of life of the person with dementia, but also on other family members and carers. So how do we do this? So we get referrals from neurologists, psychiatrists, geriatricians, GPs, and when you've come to our clinic, you would have gone through, or the person that you are looking after would have gone through some of these things. So we see the person, there's a clinical investigation, we do cognitive testing, memory test, language test, a whole range of things that may not seem relevant, but give us a good idea of how the thinking abilities of the person, at what level the person is functioning. We do a brain imaging, so to understand whether there is shrinkage in the brain and where the shrinkage might be. We'll also look at take bloods and to understand the changes in the presence of proteins in the blood, so we can measure. And that will tell us about what is happening in the brain. We do genetics in some individuals and look at risk factors for genes. And then also some of you might be also involved in the brain bank of our program. So then we can, after the person's passed away, we can have a look at the brain and get the final answer as to the diagnosis and what happened. And this is really the critical aspect of our research, because then it allows us to come back to, now that we know what it was happening in the brain, to go back to the initial presentation and ask the question, is there anything in these first changes that can tell us what the process is in the brain and inform us about these brain changes? And then we do that on a yearly basis. As you know, would have come back a few times for some of you, and then we can understand then the progression of these changes over time. So what aspects of cognition or behavior changes and what are not, and how it's relating to other things like the amount of shrinkage that we see in the brain and the regions that are involved. So what we do is to use this information to, as I mentioned, to inform the diagnosis, to develop tests that will enable us to diagnose people earlier, to inform the prognosis, and then to look at interventions. And it's around the three most important questions that most people will ask when they come to see us is, well, can you tell us what is happening? And then the next question is, well, what can I expect? What is the next phase? How is it going to progress? Is it going to be fast? Is it going to be slow? What are the changes that are likely to happen in the future? And then there's the question around, well, are there treatments? Are there drugs? What can I do to help with some of these symptoms, features? How can I manage some of these behaviors? How can I help with communication? So there are all these aspects that we're working on. So that's more the clinical level. And then there's the more sciencey aspect of this, where then for us, it's also using this clinical information to understand how the human brain is working. So how can we use this information that will inform us or tell us about how we think as human beings, and also more generally as a model of disease. So how does it differ to other brain disorders? And then also inform models of behavior. So to understand which bits of the brain are supporting things that we do in day-to-day life and how we relate to other people. And that's, for us, the important bit is also this cycle. So what we find clinically will inform the science aspect, and then the science aspect will also tell us which things to focus on clinically. So the clinical questions are informed by these more basic science aspects that we get from the clinical information. That makes sense. So some of the research projects that we've been working on over the years, so we've looked at cognition, memory, executive function, attention, social cognition, There's behavior, neuroimaging, psychiatric phenomenology, language, and Christina will tell us about apathy in a moment, and how it's related to pathology and so on. And also, you know, we ask you regularly to fill out questionnaires because we want to understand from your perspective how looking after someone with frontotemporal dementia how you perceive that and how it's changing the way you operate in day-to-day life in terms of support services that you would need, quality of life, psychological well-being, and to understand how these different things change and how we can then use this information to design better services. And so over the years, we've developed some tests, and I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly. I'm happy to talk about these in greater details, but I'm just mindful of the time and I tend to talk a lot. So, and there are a couple of things that I want to cover. So, yeah, so over the years, we've developed tests of language, program of behavior management, looking at motivations, cognitive toolkits. We connected with many centers around the world. There are not many centers working on frontotemporal dementia, and we collaborate with most of them in Europe, mostly in the UK, in Cambridge, London. In the US, there's a couple of centers in San Francisco, in Philadelphia, in South America as well, and a number of consortia we're part of. And yeah, so I was last week, I was in Amsterdam for the Frontotemporal Dementia conference. And so it's a conference that is held every 2 years. So we had it in Sydney in 2018, and then in 2020 it was cancelled because of COVID. 2022 was in Lille in France, and then last week was in Amsterdam. And 750 of us, people interested in frontotemporal dementia, as well as carers and family members, participated. And that's a photo of the team, part of the team in front of the building. Current and former team members. And I have a photo of this person. I don't know if anyone recognizes this person. This is Emma Hemming-Willis, who's the wife of Bruce Willis. So Bruce Willis was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia 2 years ago. And she's very active in this space. And so she was at the conference and was promoting the conference, was on Instagram and TikTok and making videos of different things. And she participated in this carer session and relating her personal experience on how her husband was diagnosed and how much work was still needed in that space to educate medical practitioners. Because essentially what she said was that they went to see a neurologist who saw them for about 10 minutes and told them that, yes, you have a diagnosis for frontotemporal dementia. There's no cure. There's nothing we can do about it. Here's a flyer. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And that was the end of these interactions. Yeah. And when you think, okay, if a person with the means of Bruce Willis and his family, this is the type of service that we're getting, it's telling me a lot about the rest of the population. Yeah, so there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of educating the medical community about an awareness of frontotemporal dementia, and the fact that because you have the diagnosis doesn't mean that that's the end of the road and that there's nothing that can be done about it. It's true that at the moment there's no drug, but there's still other things that we can help with, and that the community and the medical community can help with. So I think having someone like like her part of the conference is a way to really raise awareness of FTD, and it was very pleasing to see her. And she's a very, very nice lady. Pardon?
How much touring should be?
All right. So we had a number of presentations at the conference, and I just want to highlight a couple, and in particular that of Ramon. So Ramon Landin-Romero is a senior researcher with us. He's a clinical neuropsychologist. He's interested in neuroimaging, and over the years has been working on trying to find ways to understand the changes in the brain better using neuroimaging, and trying to use that as a marker of disease and of disease progression. And it's quite technical, so I'll show you some slides that are quite busy. Don't worry about them too much. But the important bit is this cartoon here. So it's showing a nerve cells, a nerve cell, a neurons with some bits in there that shouldn't be. So that's the protein accumulation that you will see in people with dementia. Different types, but it's not relevant here. But what is important is that nerve cells communicate to each other with these what is called axons. So these long streams of fibers that connect the neurons together. And when you do an MRI scan, your typical MRI scan will give you a measure of atrophy, so shrinkage of the brain, and it's measuring the nerve cells that are gone, and that's how it will show on the MRI scan. So it means that you will see part of the brain that is really atrophic or shrunk compared to other parts. But it's not telling you much about the connections, which are central to how the brain works. So the brain needs to be well, nerve cells need to communicate to each other, because that's how the signals between nerve cells will pass on, and how you get to do things like movement, thinking, regulate temperature, sleep, and everything that we do as human beings, or as beings. So Ramon's been interested in trying to understand how we can measure these changes in these connecting fibers. And essentially, there's a technical issue in how this is done. When you do an MRI scan will give you some little, hang on, I'll just, there. An MRI scan will give you some boxes like this. So the multiple hundreds, thousands of little boxes, and each box has one piece of information that will tell you how well preserved this little box is within the brain. The current technology is giving you one information and one information only. But the problem is that in many places within the brain, there are fibers that go in multiple directions. So you have fibers going up and down in the brain, going across, going back and front. But the current technology here can only tell you the main direction of these fibers within this little box. Now, what it's trying to do is to be able to unpack that and to provide information on all the fibers. So if you have fibers that go up and down and left to right. So at the moment, if you have fiber like this, you can only get one measurement. It will tell you either the ones going up or the ones going across, or even potentially telling you that the fibers are going in diagonal, because it will do some sort of combined measure of this two. And so what Ramon's been working on is to be able to understand, or to be able to detect which fibers go up and down and which fibers go in different directions. And so this is giving you an indication of the difference between these two techniques. So the ones that give you just one indication of directions of the fibers, as opposed to there where you can see that there are multiple fibers going in multiple directions. So why is it relevant? So then we can look at, so that's just technology, we don't care about that, but then that gives us an indication of a more appropriate or relevant representation of where the changes are in the brain and how much these changes are and which fibers are more or less affected. So the colors are showing the red fibers are the fibers that are going from left to right. The blue fibers are the ones going up and down, and the green fibers are the ones going back to front. And these are the changes that you can see in people with the diagnosis of behavioral frontotemporal dementia, in people with progressive non-fluent aphasia, and at the bottom in people with semantic dementia. And you can appreciate that the patterns are very different, and you can see this in this rotating brain. So at the top, the behavioral frontotemporal dementia, the changes tend to be more on both sides of the brain, whereas for the progressive non-fluent aphasia and the semantic dementia, they're more on one side, so on left hemisphere, which is where the language skills are located. And so what he did as well was to ask the question, well, how can I measure these changes over time? So can I understand how these fibers will deteriorate as the disease progresses? And so in blue is what is showing at the first time we take the scan, and the red is the progression over time. So, and then in this rotating brain, again, it's showing where these changes are, and the pink are the overlap between the two. So again, here the message is, well, yes, now we can do that. We can measure these changes more accurately, and we can also show where these changes will be over time. And then it means that we can also inform the clinical changes and how it's related to behavior, to thinking abilities, and so on. And he did the same thing for the different syndromes, so behavioral brain FTD, semantic dementia, and progressive non-fluent aphasia. But what is also important is that, so now we're able to identify more changes. We can identify the trajectories of these changes over time. And also at the biological level, it provides indices of the progression of these changes, which can then be used for, in clinical trials. So you have a measurement. So now we know where the changes will be, but also the slope of change, how quickly things will change in the brain in these connecting fibers. Now, if we have a drug trial, we can use this information to see whether the drug over time is having an effect on the slope of change. And the idea being that if you have a drug that works in maintaining brain health and nerve cells health, that slope will start to flatten. And you will see a difference between people who have the drug versus people who don't have the drug. So it's not just an academic adventure and for the intellectual research, but it has a real clinical benefit in that it can be applied for clinical trials and then help with this type of research. Now, the other thing that I wanted to highlight is in terms of clinical trials, when we organized the conference in Sydney in 2018, there was we had sponsor from one drug company. Last week, there were pilot results from 4 different clinical trials that were presented. And there were 13 drug companies present at that conference. It means that there's a lot of interest in that space. Drug companies, pharma companies are really interested, and there have been really excellent discussions about how to design trials, drug trials in the space of frontotemporal dementia, given the complexity of the disease and the presentations and what is happening in the brain. Yes, so that's exciting. That's exciting. So I'm really hopeful that in the coming years there'll be more clinical trials that will be underway. The other thing that I wanted to touch on briefly is 2 outcomes. One is this ACE calculator for GPs, and earlier on I've touched on education for clinicians and so on. So this is to help GPs to get an idea whether a person that they see in their clinic has a great, or what is the risk of this person having dementia or not. And it's a simple tool where they can plug in some information in there and give you a demonstration of how it works. And before I get on to that, on the right-hand side is a paper that we published in the Australian Journal of Aging, is about clinical recommendations post-diagnosis. And again, it's information for primary care providers about the type of things they should discuss with their patients in their clinic when there's a diagnosis of dementia. So about whether there are drugs, connections with organizations, applications for formal support service like NDIS, safety in the home, driving, and all these things that you would have encountered over the years. This has been extremely well received and has had some important impact in the field already. So what I'm going to show you is still work in progress. It's almost finished. But what it's showing you is that as a GP using the ACE, which is a screening tool that many of your loved ones would have asked to do, you get a score across different domains: attention, memory, fluency, language, visual, spatial, that gives you an overall total score out of 100. And I'll plug in just some numbers here just to show you how it works. Go like this. So here it gives you the score across different domains. And here it's giving you the score in comparison to a group of healthy controls. And under here, it's a group of individuals who have received a diagnosis of dementia of different types. And there, that gives you a risk that a score like this one would be associated with an underlying dementia. So by doing that, and so this test, this ACE test, can be done in about 10 minutes in a clinic with GPs. So by doing that and entering these numbers, that will inform their decision about, again, management and what needs to be done later on. And then there's more information about how each score relates to the general population in general and population of people with dementia in particular. And then you can explore, there's options about looking at if you're interested in just men or just women, depending on the education level, age group. So there's real flexibility there. So we're really excited about that because that's something we'll be able to deploy very soon to all GPs, and it's like all our tests, it's freely accessible from our website. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we're also in conversations with a number of people, in particular with AFTDA, with the Rare Dementia Support in the UK, and with the FTD Disorder Registry in the US. What is lacking here in Australia is a common space where people can access information about frontotemporal dementia, and it will be geared for families, but also for clinicians, for researchers. So the idea is to have some sort of matchmaking space. So if you as a family are interested in participating in clinical trials, then there's a space for you to go and find information about clinical trials. If you're a researcher interested in finding people to participate in studies, that will be a space for that. And to have all sorts of information available, which is, at the moment, I know it's a very detective work trying to, trawl through the website and finding information that is of good quality. So I'm hoping that within the next year or so, we'll be able to have something up and running. So, I don't like to blow my own trumpet, but going to the conference also made me realize how Frontal is a good group, and we are ranked in the top 5 in the world in research on frontotemporal dementia. And so we're participating in a number of international collaborations. And, if you look at the number of articles, scientific articles published in the past 20 years, so in 2000, it was about 100 per year, and now we're about 800 every year. So there's an increasing interest in understanding frontotemporal dementia. Again, this bringing together all these people from around the world will help accelerate outcomes and research in this space. And again, I'm quite proud of this. There was a paper recently published about research on frontotemporal dementia, where it's done and by whom. And so again, FTD Frontal is ranked in the top 5, and in the top 10 researchers, there's 2 of us ranked. So from around the world in research, 20% of the 2 of the top 10 researchers are found here. So yeah, and it's a testament of the quality of the work that has been done by the whole group. And I'm blessed to be able to work with talented individuals who are really committed to this field and who are passionate about understanding FTD and trying to find treatments and improve the life of people living with FTD. So that's a couple of photos. We managed to relax a little bit with a boat tour on the canals of Amsterdam last week. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Yes, sure. Oh, okay. The question in the room was whether there are sex differences across the different subtypes of frontotemporal dementia. Overall, there's a slightly greater risk in males and females of having frontotemporal dementia. It's particularly the case in the behavioral variant, less so in the 2 other presentations, so semantic dementia and primary progressive aphasia, progressive non-fluent aphasia. I must admit that there's not a lot of studies that have looked at that in details, and some of the findings are a bit conflicting, depending on what you read. We published a couple of papers some years ago looking at comparing people where there's a strong family history, where we know that there's the cause of the disease is due to a gene defect, as opposed to the population of people diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia where there's no genetic causes. So in people with the genetic cause, we see this discrepancy more, whereas in the people with non-genetic cause of the disease, it seems that it's more equal. But again, there's a bit of variability. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Which is different to Alzheimer's disease, where the literature is indicating that women have a greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than males. Okay, so the question is, how do you do gene testing? It depends. If you can do gene testing in hospitals in a clinical setting, but under the condition where only if there's a strong family history, so if there's evidence that there is a dementia across multiple generations, so then you can request clinical genetic testing. That's something that would be discussed with the GP or the specialist that would then refer you to an appropriate service. In the research setting, it's slightly different in that you can request a testing for different genes, but then the question is whether people want to know or not, and under what conditions. So that's a very complex process, because obviously you don't want to say, yes, I'll give my blood and I'll get to know whether I've got a gene for that. If you're not affected, you don't want necessarily to know, or even if you're affected, you might not want to know because there's no cure at the moment. So is that something you want to carry for the rest of your life? So that's very individual decision to be made that requires careful thinking about. And that's why there are specialist clinics for that to go through this process.